Synesthesia is the experience of where senses converge, where everything comes together. And it's an experience that many people are familiar with if you've done psychedelics or even if you haven't. It's an experience of a peak perceptual experience, right? And the talk is basically going to be about the way in which synesthetic experience is the reservoir, is the treasury of renewal. The very first panel talked about these kinds of experiences as renewing experiences where you go back to unlock what's been locked up. And I'm going to talk about it from various perspectives. Noah started off the day with talking about various disciplines and various frameworks, and I'm going to do various frameworks. And interdisciplinarity is kind of the academic, the nerd equivalent of synesthesia. So we start with this. I mean, it's going to be very textual. I'm a text guy. You can see the religious affiliation there. Okay, I'm going to start with the text. Actually, I'm going to end with the text too. The operations of the mind are continuous and inchoate, extending well beyond an individual's conscious control. Attempts to differentiate thought into categories such as ideational or intellectual, or against emotional or passionate, are dubious at best. Now, who could have written such a quote? Maybe Timothy Leary, maybe some advocate of psychedelic experience, maybe some mystic, no. Larry Tribe. Larry Tribe was a professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. He still is a constitutional law expert, and at least when I was in law school, he was the leading constitutional law theorist, certainly here, but also probably in America, one of the last great syntheses of liberal constitutional law theory. And this comes in a part of his book, which is trying to bring together in a grand reconstruction all kinds of rights of personhood and privacy and freedom of religion, speech and imagination and everything, and, of course, psychedelics. So he says this: several courts have held that the use of specific psychoactive substances is protected in connection with genuine religious ceremonies to which the substances are essential. And he mostly has in mind the peyote cases relating to the Native American Church, which were then bubbling their way towards an unfortunate end in the Supreme Court. And then he says this: but few have reached the conclusion that the basic assertion of governmental power over the individual psyche in this area is illegitimate as a matter of due process. So he really raises the question about whether there's a right to psychedelic drugs as a constitutional right. And I have to say, when I read this in law school, I thought, wow, great, it's really a connection between my life before law school and my life in law school. And that's what he's saying here, right? He's questioning that. Of course, that never happened, but that was where he got to through thinking about it, through thinking about synesthetic experience, right? Through thinking about this idea that the operations of the mind are continuous. Okay, and then he says this. He says, in seeking a flattening or repression of the inner self, government might attempt to regulate the ways in which the mind processes sensory data. He says, stated like that, it seems preposterous, but courts that affirm the power of government to ban the use of such psychoactive substances as marijuana and others appear to be saying something very much like that, right? And what he really wants to do is he wants to go back to the synesthetic experience in order to renew law by drawing on that reservoir. Okay. Let's switch disciplines. Merleau-Ponty was a crucial French phenomenological philosopher in mid-century who wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Perception, which sort of, well, anyway, here's what he says. The perceived thing lies in the equivalence among all its sensible properties, which caused Cézanne to say that one should be able to paint even odors. Right? He's pointing to synesthetic experience. He's founding an entire philosophy based on perception, based on embodied perception. And when you look at embodied perception, what you get to is synesthesia. And then, of course, he talks about mescaline. Because mescaline intoxication delivers the subject over to his vitality, we would expect it to encourage forms of synesthesia. So again, this idea that vitality, true life, original vitality, and we could make all kinds of critiques of it, but whatever, is synesthesia, right? And you get back to it through, he says, through mescaline. One subject under the influence of mescaline finds a piece of iron. He taps it on the windowsill and exclaims, voila, magique. And the trees become greener, right? We talked about magic earlier in the day, right? And here we're rediscovering it, right? This idea that how do we interpret this, what he thinks, Merleau-Ponty thinks really is the original experience and really is the experience underlying all experience of synesthesia. And he says, the subject does not tell us merely that he has a sound and a color at the same time. It is the sound that he sees at the place where colors form. Merleau-Ponty is poetic best. Now, to law a little bit, as metaphor. Perceived things are not bounded entities whose laws of construction we possess a priori. We don't impose laws of construction on the thing, a la Kant, but are rather open, inexhaustible systems. If perceived qualities radiate, if they have a power to enchant, if they have a sacramental value, this is because the sensing subject sympathizes with them and finds in them his momentary law, right? So where is law renewed? And again, obviously he's using law here somewhat as a metaphor, but somewhat in a philosophical sense. It's renewed through being able to contact that original synesthetic experience. Okay, now I'm coming back to my cover image. Let's go to Kabbalah. And who do we find? We have one of the greatest Kabbalah scholars of our time, Elliot Wolfson, who tells us this. In some Kabbalistic sources, the Sephirotic emanations are concomitantly experienced as audible voices and visible lights. Mystical knowledge entails synesthesia, as Elliot Wolfson writing in one of his early books, Through a Speculum That Shines, right? Sephirotic emanations are these archetypal divine emanations that some of the representations of which was on my cover slide, okay? Of course, this idea harkens back to the Bible and the theophany at Mount Sinai with the famous verse, all the people were seeing the voices and the torches and the sounds of the ram's horn. They were seeing the voices and the torches and the sounds and the mountain and smoke, right? It's the paradigm of synesthetic experience in the Jewish tradition. So let me conclude, my concluding slides is now Kabbalah. So if my title has the word Nomopoesis, which was just sort of maybe an overly fancy word, which means literally just making law, but if we think of poiesis not in the Greek sense, but in the sense in which it came to mean poetry, we have both of those senses. Now, synesthetic or mixed imagery, going from one sense to another, is the basic idiom of the central collection of texts in Kabbalah, which is called the Zohar, written in Spain in 13th century in Aramaic. And here's just one passage of shifting from sense to sense to sense to sense. At the moment when Jews mystically recite, "Hear, O Israel," a light comes forth from the hidden upper world. This light strikes the dark lamp and divides into 70 lights, and those 70 lights divide into the 70 branches of the tree of life. Light becomes, the light metaphor becomes arboreal, then this tree gives rise to sweet fragrances. We move to the olfactory, and all the trees of the Garden of Eden give rise to fragrances, and they praise their Lord. So we go from light to trees to singing to, okay. For at that time the queen prepares herself, At that time the queen prepares herself to enter under the bridal canopy with her spouse. We go from light to trees to fragrances to song to sex, to divine sex, right? And when does this happen? It happens through a mystical technique, the mystical technique of the Jewish recitation of the Hero Israel, the basic doxa of Judaism, right? So it's a mystical technique which launches basically the recreation of the world, because this is an image of the recreation of the world, through synesthetic experience, right? So the doxa, right, the basic statement of faith, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is one, right? That basic doxa that every Jew is supposed to believe in, that law, right, launches, or the only way to really say it is by relaunching the synesthetic experience, which is the basic recreative power of the universe. Okay. Now, people might know the word Torah. Torah is the Jewish word for the Bible, maybe the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, but actually it really is a broader word, meaning all sacred books in the Jewish tradition is Torah. And Torah, it's in Hebrew, it's not exactly in English, but this is actually a translation from the Aramaic oraita, 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 which just means Torah, 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 and so forth. Rabbi Shimon, this is from the Zohar again, Rabbi Shimon cried and wailed. So there's this idea of there is some technique, and again, Ellie's written about weeping as mystical technique. We're crying and wailing, right? Cries and wails. He opens saying, quotes a verse, "A loving doe, a graceful gazelle, let her breasts ever quench your thirst. Lose yourself always in her love." That's a verse from Proverbs. It's already mixed imagery, synesthesia, and so forth. And then Rabbi Shimon says, "Oh, all right, the radiance of all worlds. How many seas, rivers, springs, and fountains spread from you in all directions? From you comes all, upon you depend those above and those below." The Torah, this book of law, becomes a gushing spring, right? It's law proclaiming, but it's actually a spring. You can get drenched by it, right? And there's the Hebrew word for receiving divine inspiration is lishrok, which really means originally to be soaked. Supernal radiance surely emanates from you. It's water, it's light, it's law, it's a doe. You are a loving doe, a graceful gazelle, for above and below. Among your lovers, who will be worthy of suckling from you fittingly? And now in this ecstasy, we don't even know if we're talking about a maternal relationship or we're talking about a sexual relationship. Sigmund Freud, call your office. He wept and placed his head between his knees and kissed the dust. There's a clear reference here to some kind of technique for inducing trance, inducing mystical experience. He placed his head between the knees, a very well-known technique for inducing trance states. Just then, he saw many images of the companions surrounding him, right? So he has yet a further vision, and this vision now is of his colleagues. And now, to finish, last slide. This is just a reference to something, a part of this work, the Zohar, the Book of Radiance, which seems to allude, can't prove it, to some kind of a technique involving a flower, involving some kind of herb for inducing trance. Can't prove it. Nonetheless, here it is. And it's called the mystical companions are traveling through the heavenly spheres, and they have all these incredible experiences. And often when the times comes for them to transition from one space to another, from a cave to a wide open space, to an orchard, to a heaven, to an academy, to a temple, somebody hands them a rose, and they inhale it, and they get magically transported. And this is just a little segment from it, and I chose it because it culminates in law, because it has to do with that. The minister, some heavenly minister, gave them another rose, and they left the cave. It enabled them to depart from this mystical cave where they were having some other mystical experiences. As they emerged, the mouth of the cave closed and could not be seen at all. So the whole cave, was it real? Was it not real? It seems to now disappear. What cave? You were in a cave? What cave? I didn't see a cave, right? Here, take this rose. They saw the eagle descending from the tree, entering another cave. They smelled the rose and entered there. They found that eagle at the mouth of the cave. They entered. They arrived at another orchard, accompanied by the eagle. Now, after these experiences of moving from space to space, often triggered by this inhaling of something, of some kind of flower or some kind of plant, then what do they reach? The masters of Mishnah. Mishnah is a code of Jewish law from the 2nd century. When they reach the masters of Mishnah, so now they're going to learn law. So through this synesthetic experience, through this drug experience, they finally reach the masters of law. That eagle turned into the image of a man in a splendid garment, radiant like them, and he sat down together with them. Right? So the law, far from being this fixed thing handed down, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, right, is prepared by this experience, by this synesthetic experience triggered by some kind of herb, some kind of plant, right? And I would put it to you, once that law becomes ossified and reified and calcified, it can be renewed and fluidified and enlightened through dipping back into the great reservoir of synesthesia. Thank you.